Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I know it's early on the final day of the conference. So welcome to this session on violence against women in developing economies. We have 3 presenters today, so there'll be about 25 minutes each for the presentation, and then 5 minutes or so for questions. So I'm going to pass over to Neha Hui from the University of Reading, who's going to kick us off. Thanks.
Thanks for the introduction, Sam. Very welcome on the last day. I'm going to talk about political conflict and domestic violence in the case of Nigeria. Now, the motivation for this research is that a lot of rehabilitation and reconstruction efforts after conflict is with the view or is geared towards direct consequences of conflict, including things like loss of life, loss of property, injuries to war, etc. However, there is an increasing concern over the indirect effects of war, including things like displacement, reduced consumption, maternal mortality, gendered violence, etc. And these indirect effects seem to disproportionately affect women over men. So in this paper, I am looking at one such indirect effect of political conflict on female civilians in the form of domestic violence. Now, I am looking at the case of Nigeria because Nigeria has a culture where domestic violence is quite deeply entrenched in society. In fact, only 2 of the Nigerian states actually have a law which criminalizes domestic violence. And it also has a history of armed conflicts. So they had their civil war between 1967 and 1970, and they've had recurring episodes of armed conflicts, which have escalated from 2009 onwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exploit the variation of pattern of armed conflict across the country and look at how exposure to armed conflict may affect vulnerability to domestic violence. Now, one major concern is that there are unobserved factors which may correlate both to private and public forms of violence. So I'm going to try and explore an appropriate instrument to control for endogeneity that I'm going to talk about in a bit. And then I'm also going to explore the mechanisms through which increased political conflict results in increased domestic violence. So just briefly looking at the literature. So the literature on domestic violence is quite broad. I mean, it defines domestic violence as violence perpetrated by intimate partner or other members of family, and there's a sort of a physical, sexual, psychological, economic abuse. All of them constitute domestic violence, and it is prevalent across the world with no exceptions. And sub-Saharan Africa is not an exception. And there have been diverse factors that have been noted to contribute towards domestic violence in sub-Saharan Africa, including things like lineage, genital mutilation, risk of HIV, extraction industry, etc. In Nigeria as well, there is quite a large literature that I'm not going to talk to, but then to my knowledge, there is no systematic study linking domestic violence to political conflict. So that is where this paper makes a contribution. Now, there does exist a literature that looks at societal and institutional factors that lead to violent behavior. And in particular, exposure to violence elsewhere has been linked in the literature to current violent behavior. For example, Pollock's work looks at how individuals who have been exposed to domestic violence amongst their parents are both more likely to, if they are the perpetrator, or usually the men, if they are the perpetrators of the violence, they're more likely to be violent, and if they are victims, they're more likely to continue living in the violent relationship. And so this is one form of exposure. But exposure to political conflict and the links between political conflict and domestic violence has also been discussed in the literature, especially political science and sociology literature, notably in Payne's work, who argued that global terrorism has common foundations and commonalities with what she called everyday terrorism, domestic violence. And in the case of development economics literature, there has also been some study. For example, Wink and Palm have used primary data for Liberia to look at the relationship between political conflict and domestic violence. OSPI has done the same for 17 sub-Saharan nations, and Martina has done it for Rwanda. My work builds on the work on OSPI and Martina. So all of us, we use geocoded armed conflict data. And all of us, we also use the demographic and health survey data. I have also followed them in trying to understand the mechanisms of increased violence. However, I have also spent some time thinking about the possible endogeneity and controlling for them. So I've got 3 hypotheses that I tried to test using the data that I'm going to describe in a second. First is, does exposure to violence elsewhere, in this case political conflict, actually increase domestic violence? That is the first hypothesis that I'm going to try and test. But then the question is that, why? What happens? Does something happen to the women? So is it that the political conflict is reducing the women's bargaining power, her agency? I mean, assuming that the victim is women. Or is it that something is happening to the perpetrator of the violence? So is it that political conflict is increasing violent behavior or controlling behavior of the men? So to test this hypothesis, I use 2 data sources. The first is the armed conflict and location events data, data that is open source, made available by the University of Sussex. It is quite an interesting data source. It provides dates and geographic locations of political conflicts. It gives us details of what kind of political conflicts, so battles, civilian killings, riots, protests, etc. And it also gives us information about who the perpetrators are, who the belligerents, as it's called, are. So, I mean, something to note is that this is, I think, as far as I understand, this is based on reportings by English language newspapers, so there might be a little bit of bias there. But it's still quite a extensive data set that is used a lot in conflict studies. And so as we can see, so the blue line is all events of political violence in Nigeria. So post 2009, there has been a spike in the events of political conflict, and this is what we're going to use in this paper. Now, for the individual level data, I use DHS data set. I'm sure many people here do it. So as many people know that the later rounds include questions on domestic violence and women's empowerment, gender attitude, etc. I only use the 2013 DHS data, the 6th wave. And what I'm going to use is the households are grouped as clusters, and these clusters are georeferenced. So I'm going to use this georeferencing for my identification. So I'll briefly go through what my main dependent variables and my main covariates are. So my first dependent variable that I'm going to use is, well, domestic violence. So it's a measure of emotional, physical, sexual violence by an intimate partner. And so it corresponds to whether or not the individual faced violence in the previous 12 months. I also use, as robustness check, I also see whether the results are valid for whether or not the individuals ever faced violence rather than just 12 months. So for my mechanism hypothesis, I have 2 variables. One is agency. So I basically use decision-making as a proxy for agency, as has been done quite a lot in the literature. So the individuals were asked various questions on who makes decisions, so decisions on how they spend their own earning, on healthcare, household purchase, visiting family, etc. And I use principal component analysis to create a variable decision that is a continuous variable that takes value between 0 and 1. Similarly, as I'm also interested in what happens to the controlling behavior of the partner, the individuals were asked questions on the controlling behavior of their partner. So women were asked if their husbands were jealous if they spoke to other men, if their partners accused them of unfaithfulness, if they didn't let them meet female friends, etc. So it is to be noted here that the controlling behavior is from the point of view of the women. So of course, I appreciate that I'm quite limited here because I have no idea what the men are actually thinking. So this is self-reported from the women's point of view. But anyway, I use this as a proxy for controlling behavior of the men. I use principal component analysis again to create a variable control. It is continuous, takes value between 0 and 1. Now, okay, so I'm interested to see what exposure to political conflict does to domestic violence. Now, what I do is I use the geocoded ACLED data, the armed conflict data, and the DHS data. And so for every DHS cluster, I build a buffer around it. So in the base model, I build a buffer of 20 kilometers around each DHS cluster, and I count the number of events of political conflict that have taken place in the 10 years previous to the year of interview. So the year of interview was 2013, and I count how many events of political conflict took place in the buffer of 20 kilometers in the period between 2002 and 2012. So in the base model, I look at all events of violence, but I also consider different categories. I consider events of high fatality. I consider only battles, etc. And I also consider only recent years. So rather than looking at the 10-year period, I also look at just 2 years previous to the year of interview. As I mentioned, in the base model, I consider a buffer of 20 kilometers, but I also consider different buffer sizes, so 10, 30, 40, 50 kilometers. Okay. Now, this is what it looks like. So the blue circles are the buffers, and the red dot, I think it's one particular year. I can't remember what year it is. And so basically, I count the number of red dots. So red dots are the events of political conflict. So I count the number of red dots in each blue circle. All right. Now, the thing is that there might be observed factors that are correlated both to the incidence of political conflict and domestic violence. So we need to think of an instrument that is strongly correlated with conflict intensity, but uncorrelated with outcome variables. Now, something that is interesting about the history of Nigeria, like many former colonies, is that the current administrative border of Nigeria was actually only created in 1914, pretty much arbitrarily by the colonial British government. And in doing so, they amalgamated a set of some 200 different ethnic societies, which were not necessarily an obvious, not necessarily uniform in terms of governance, institutions, etc., into one country. And then after Nigeria became an independent country, there was a lot of consolidation of power amongst some ethnic groups, which led to a lot of discontent amongst the more minority groups. Which suggests that, ethnic diversity might be strongly linked to historical and contemporary conflicts in Nigeria. So I try and exploit this characteristic of Nigerian history. So I use ethnographic atlas, the World Atlas Society that has been provided by Murdoch and has been digitized by Nunn in 2007. So Murdoch provides geographic coordinates of pre-colonial societies. And what I do is I calculate the distance of each of the clusters in the DHS dataset to the closest border of a pre-colonial ethnic society. So just to show you the picture, the red outline that you can see is the contemporary border of Nigeria. The black inside borders are borders of pre-colonial ethnic societies. And the blue dots are the DHS clusters. So I calculate the distance of each of these blue dots to the closest black border with the view that the further away the cluster is from a pre-colonial border, the less likely are they to be facing political conflict. So that is the instrument that I use. So basically, this is the equation that I'll be estimating to just show you the results. So in this model, the results that you see, this table, the dependent variable is whether or not the individual faced domestic violence in the past 12 months. Our main covariate is all events of political conflict in the previous 10 years. Now, if we don't control for endogeneity, the results are not significant at all. But once we control for endogeneity, we get an increase of 0.2% percentile points with an unit increase in event of political conflict. And at the mean, this translates to about a 9% increase in political conflict, which is not insignificant. And if we consider only recent events, so only events of the previous 2 years, the result becomes more than double, right? The coefficient becomes more than doubled. If we consider sort of more significant events of political conflict, so for example, battles, the result is even higher. So, I can't exactly remember what it translates to, but it's quite significant. And finally, if we increase the buffer size, so from 10 kilometer, 20 kilometers, 30, 40, 50 kilometer, the results continue to stay significant. However, the size of the coefficient seems to shrink. Okay. Now, the next step is to try and see what the mechanisms are. So is it that women, as a consequence of the political conflict, are they losing bargaining power? Is this what is happening? Or is it that men are becoming more controlling? Okay. So here I'm just showing you the results, the second stage results of what happens when we have decision and control as the dependent variable, and all recent events of political conflict as the main covariate. So events of political conflict seems to decrease the decision-making power of the women, and also seems to be increasing the controlling behavior of their husbands. And if we sort of use it as a pathway, so if we put the decision and the control variables in our original model, where faced domestic violence in the last 12 months was our dependent variable, so having decision as a covariate does not seem to change our main estimator, but then having control, when we put control as a covariate, the estimator stops being significant. This makes me think that maybe what's happening is that men are becoming more controlling, more violent, and that is what's leading to the increased domestic violence. I did a number of robustness checks. I checked what would happen if I looked at whether the individual ever faced domestic violence. The result was quite robust. I had different variations in the definitions of political conflict. I used Probit and IV Probit to check how the results look. I also did a placebo. And I can show you these results if anyone wants to have a look. And I also did one result that I wanted to show you was what happened for 2008. So what happened for DHS survey in the previous wave. Now that was before the escalation of political violence, especially before groups like Boko Haram became extremely powerful in Nigeria. So there, this is all recent events. There, the second stage is no longer significant, and the first stage is actually negative. The linear probability model is actually negative. And what I feel is that what I feel the difference is that in 2008, because the escalation of political violence had not happened to the scale that it currently is, we don't see the effect. And additionally, before 2009, the events of political conflict were not as much towards civilian population. They were more groups fighting with each other. And I feel that that might be what is reflected in this, these results, but then that's something that I will probably need to look more into. I will finish before time. And so the results suggest that there is close proximity that close proximity to political conflict does increase vulnerability to domestic violence. The effect reduces as we increase buffer size. And then I looked a bit into what the mechanisms might be, and the political conflict seems to both increase control issues of partner and reduce decision making. But then as a pathway, it seems like controlling behavior has more of an effect. Something that I want to note here is that amongst the limitations of the study, one major limitation that I have no idea what to do about is that I can't take into account that with conflict, there is outmigration. People move. And that is unfortunately something that is not reported in the DHS-6 for Nigeria. So that is something that I can't quite take into account. So if there's any suggestion of what I could do with that, to do with how to take into account outmigration would be quite useful. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Neha. Are there any questions at all?
Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the data set reports various forms of political violence, which includes, things that are reasonably harmless, possibly harmless, including riots, including, say, protests. But then it goes on to battles for territory, etc. So I have tried to understand the effect of both on domestic violence with the view that, okay, it's true that, say, a battle or an insurgency might have different effect than a riot, and hence it is important to differentiate. But then I have also tried to understand the effect of all political violence because, just generally, the locality being unsafe because of events of violence. I mean, it's not just the actual event of violence, it's also the fear around something bad is going to happen. So that's why, and hence it's important to both try and distinguish between the different forms of violence, which in the paper I have done, but also look at generally unsafe sort of environment because of the fear of violence. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Maybe just understanding. So I was wondering whether you do or you could exploit the duration of conflict. So you're looking at intensity to
Yeah.
count.
Yeah.
If you think more from a sort of different type
Yeah.
of changing social norms,
Yeah.
you would expect that as the duration increases,
Yeah.
they happen differently in the past.
Yeah. No, that is a very important point. I have not taken that into account, but that's something to think about, definitely.
And the other question, which is I think related actually to your outmigration slide.
Yes.
If I recall correctly, and I may be wrong, the bargaining
Sorry, comes?
Bargaining power effect of conflict kicks in, I think in the Martina and so on, a little
Yeah.
due to the changing the population composition.
Yes. Yeah.
Fraction of
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's obviously
Yeah.
related.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether there's any census data or anything else you could possibly match in
At a higher level. Okay.
anywhere on GIS
Yeah.
already.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good suggestion. Yes. I mean, Martina does look at census data, so that might be something to take into account. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, and yes.
Since your kind of motivation was that you were kind of what your paper adds to it is trying to address the endogeneity. Do you know? So, like, my intuition says that being near a border, like you said, may increase violence. But could it also have effects on, like, say, things like income, right? So,
Right. So the thing is that, the DHS data source is reasonably rich, so I did control for various things, including income, employment, etc. Something that is that I should have mentioned, and that is quite important, is that so different ethnic groups might have different gender norms, which might mean that it might get reflected in domestic violence. So I did control for ethnic groups, for example, and I'm hoping that that would sort of take that into account.
So, but can you look at, like, distance from border and how it correlates with these other things? Right? Things
Right.
like income is the most obvious one that comes to mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Place that's had a lot of violence in the past.
Yeah.
Poor there, and we know that
Yeah. Yeah.
poverty does correlate with
Yeah.
violence.
Yeah.
Just being able to see if any of these
Things do actually matter. Yeah.
distance from
Yeah. All right. Yeah. That would be something to check. But then I did, control for all these. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. 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 Thank you. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. These are things that I should probably, check and put in the appendix. Yeah.
And Bansi?
Urban. Yeah. I did control for urban and rural as well. Yeah. So yeah. Right. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll take that into account. Yeah.
Just actually hinging on what was just said, it's Nigeria, so you may want to split the south from the north.
From the north, yeah. I mean, again, all these things, at least as controls, I have included. Yeah. Do. All right. So run the. Run different models. Yeah, definitely south and north. I did check it that way as well. But then the other points, yeah, I'll take that into account.
Okay, any other questions? No? Thank you. So next up, we have Kanika from Ashoka University.
Thanks to all of you for coming for this session. So the paper that I'm going to present today, it examines the issue of violence against women and a specific type of violence, which is public safety of women in the context of India. And we're going to look at a particular regulation change in the context of one of the states and what could be the possible effects of that on reported incidents of sexual assaults faced by women in public spaces. So just to give you a brief overview, this is what the paper is about and a preview of the results. So the question that we're asking is, there's a very specific policy intervention that's happening where these bars which are serving hard liquor are being shut down. What kind of an impact can this policy or this intervention have on crimes against women outside their homes? The methodology that we're going to follow, we'll primarily follow two methodologies. One will be a difference in difference estimation, and the other will be a synthetic control method to evaluate the effect. In terms of what we find that there is a negative effect on crimes reported by women in terms of the sexual assaults reported by them after this policy came into effect. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of how crime data is reported in India, and how does it look like. So we basically have different types of crimes recorded by the National Crime Record Bureau, which takes these FIRs reported in the police stations, and then it reports, it just clubs these crimes together under different IPCs, and that's how they're reported for a researcher. And we can broadly club these crimes into two types, one which are committed within the household against the women, which primarily refers to domestic violence by the husband and by relatives, and the other is the crimes committed against them mostly outside home, which refer to molestation, sexual harassment, eve-teasing, etc. So if one were to look at the last 15 years and how crime reporting is changing in India, it's like the crimes reported against women have been increasing secularly. In fact, a sharp increase because of reporting between 2005 and 2010. So how are these crimes composed of? So I'm going to talk about these categories that we're looking at in this paper. So I'm going to just club them together. So first, the category of assault, which involves sexual harassment, intent to disrobe, in some sense, some sort of a physical contact between the woman and the perpetrator. And it falls under the IPC, or the Indian Penal Code 354. Then we have the other category, which basically refers to passing of lewd remarks, eve-teasing, etc., but not involving any physical touch as such, which is reported under IPC 509. Then we have rape, which is the extreme form of sexual assault against women. Cruelty is what we refer to as domestic violence by husband or the relatives. Then we have dowry deaths. In India, there is a custom called dowry where the bride's parents are supposed to pay an amount to the groom's parents, and sometimes when the groom's family thinks that the amount is inadequate, they sometimes even kill the wife. Lastly, we have kidnapping and importation of girls, but we won't be looking at that because that's not relevant for us. So how are these different crimes composed of amongst the total crimes reported against women? The largest category is actually the category of domestic violence. So we have 35% of reported incidences among the total crimes categorized under domestic violence. And the second largest category is actually the category of assaults. Primarily, assaults can be sexual assaults. Mostly they're the sexual assaults that women face, and they form about a quarter of the total crimes against women reported in India. Now, so there has been some literature on, some general literature on how alcohol can act as a mediator, in the propensity to commit crime by a person. But the causality is often been circumspect because of presence of unobservables. In terms of theory, how does it tie up? We have the theoretical model by Becker, which refers to the marginal benefit and marginal cost of committing a crime. And this model was actually modified by Zimmerman in 2004 to include alcohol as a potential mediator. And this was done by, by assuming that if you consume alcohol, you can decrease your risk aversion, and you can also, it can change your perceptions of costs and benefits by changing the rate of discount at which you're evaluating them. So what's the role for public policy? So there is some link, we have these crimes happening, and there is some theory about the fact that alcohol can be a mediating factor in affecting these different crimes, not just against women, but general crimes as well. So what's the role for public policy here? How have the governments been dealing with this? Well, one is through imposition of taxes, regulating outlet densities of outlets which sell alcohol, by controlling the minimum legal drinking age at which people are eligible to buy drinks at a bar. So there's a huge review of this literature. Largely this literature exists for the US. In terms of the different policies adopted by the US state governments over time, over the last 20, 25 years. And these two papers offer a very good review of these studies. Now, what has not been looked at or is, if you can also have some controls around the type of liquor that is consumed, not just all these above public, these possible actions that can be taken, but also, can the type of liquor which is being consumed in these bars, which serve as drinking spaces in the public, can that also have some sort of an effect on crimes reported? So the policy that we're going to look at in this paper was implemented in the state of Kerala in India. And what happened in that policy was that, there were these bars, and Kerala is famous for these local bars, which serve liquor. And all the bars that were serving hard liquor were shut down. They were told, you need to shut down. And all of that happened because of the political economy aspect. The government was accused by the opposition that you're in cahoots with the liquor lobby. So just to show that, no, we are not. It just said, OK, just curb all the hard liquor bars. The only thing that you can sell in these bars now is wine and beer, and a local mildly alcoholic drink called toddy. And this happened in 2014. So by August 2014, all the bars that were serving hard liquor were shut down in Kerala. There was also some shutting down of shops that were selling liquor in general, but that was very little, about 10%. So what happened? What kind of an effect happened on the sale of hard liquor, which is actually referred to as IMFL in India? And what happened to the consumption of beer? So beer had no effect, right? But hard liquor was affected. And if you look at the data on sales, you find that suddenly in 2014 and 2015, there was a decline in the sale of hard liquor. So you could still buy hard liquor, but you could buy it in a liquor vend and then consume it at home. What you couldn't do is have hard liquor in a local bar. That you couldn't do anymore. On the other hand, if you look at beer, sale of beer was pretty much stagnant, falling. And suddenly in 2015, you see this increase. So people had switched over to beer in a matter of a year. So in these bars, they were mostly consuming beer. That's what it seems like. So what's happening to the crime rate against women in Kerala? So again, this shows an increasing trend till 2010. And then it's pretty much flat post 2010. And there's a sudden dip in post 2014. And we want to analyze this dip that we see here in this portion of the curve. What's the existing evidence on India? Well, no paper has looked at this particular policy, but there is some evidence on alcohol bans. So India is a very unique country in the sense that there are certain states which actually ban alcohol. And there have been papers which have looked at this complete banning of alcohol on crimes and on different things, and they found a negative effect. Recently, people have looked at the alcohol ban in the state of Bihar. The effects here are ambiguous, but yeah, still stacked at the negative side as far as crime rates against women are concerned. Now, what we're going to use in the empirical strategy in this paper is that while Kerala had this policy, the neighboring states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, which are very similar to Kerala, did not have this change in policy, at least during the years up till 2015. So this is the state of Kerala in the southern tip of India, and you have these bordering districts of Kerala which lie in the neighboring states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So the red districts are the ones which lie in Kerala, and the green districts are the ones which are lying in the controlled states. So in some specifications, we'll look at only these border districts. In other specifications, we'll look at all the districts of the neighboring two states, but the results don't change much. And these districts are quite big. So it's not possible to go from one border district to the other border district to consume alcohol. They're really huge administration units, so they're not small. Okay, so let me come to the empirical strategy, which is a simple difference in difference estimator. So we have the different crime categories as a dependent variable, and then we have this regulation change. We control for district and time fixed effects, and we also have district specific time trends in reporting, because we know that crime is also subject to reporting. And we have state level controls on police force per capita as well as income per capita. And we weight the regressions by district population, cluster the standard errors by district. We know that the number of clusters are going to be small, so we also use wild cluster bootstrap method. The results don't change, so we still find significant effects. Okay, so before I move on to the empirical results, I wanted to show you the graph on sexual assaults and what's happening. So we have these districts which are control districts, and then we have the red ones which are Kerala's districts. And we find that post this policy came into effect, There was a fall in these cases reported in Kerala, slight increase in the neighboring districts. If you look at the pre-trends, now the pre-trends don't match exactly. There's an issue there, and they're not completely matching. But if anything, it's rising. If anything, if you look at pre the policy change, there was an increase in the sexual assault incidences being reported in Kerala, and you find this dip happening after the policy came into effect. For eve teasing, etc., we find similar trends, but nothing really happening post the regulation. Things don't change for rape or for domestic violence. The trends remain same across control and by the way, why are we even interested in domestic violence? So the reason why I want to look at domestic violence is, although this policy is only affecting consumption outside home, what could be the other, unintended consequences that, now I'm going to have alcohol in my house, right? I have the option of buying hard liquor and consuming in my house. So what if I am now consuming this hard liquor in greater proportion at home and indulging in greater domestic violence, beating up my wife more? That could be one mechanism where this policy could have an unintended consequence. So we want to look at whether there's anything happening on the front of domestic violence as well. Well, we also have information on treatment intensity. So we got this information from the Excise Department of Kerala, in which they told us that the initial number of bars to begin with in each district were different. So when this policy came into effect, all these bars were shut down. So essentially, you had different districts being exposed to different levels of treatment because of the existing number of bars that were shut down. So we got this information on the number of bars that were shut down in each district, and then we can use this as a treatment intensity variable to see if whatever results we actually find, are they actually being driven by bar closure, or is it something else that's driving these results? Okay, so coming to the estimates on the DID, we find a significantly negative effect on sexual assaults. So the sexual assault incidences reduced by 73 in an year per district on average, and that's approximately 25% of the total number of incidences. And on the higher side, it's about 33% if one takes the second specification in which we have state level controls. Looking at insults, there is a slightly negative effect, but nothing significant happening on the other crime variables. And here we have our control as all the districts of the neighboring states. Okay. When we restrict our control areas to only the border districts of the neighboring two states, here we find that, again, there's a significant effect and pretty much similar in magnitude. Now we also find a significant effect on incidences of eve teasing and not just sexual assaults. The others, again, remain insignificant. Nothing's happening with either rape or domestic violence or dowry death. Now, rape is quite underreported in India, and this variable has often been taken with a pinch of salt. None of the previous studies in India have found any significant effect of policy changes on rapes because it's so underreported. So this is one variable that we should be very skeptical about. Even if there would have been an effect, maybe because of the general underreporting, it's not just showing up. So with the treatment intensity, we find, again, it's actually the bar closures which are driving this result and not anything else. So if the number of bars that were closed down in a particular district increased by 1, the number of incidences reported in that particular district in that year came down by approximately 3.5. Here we find actually some positive effect on rape, which we can just hold on for a second, because I'll show you the pre-trends which don't match for rape, and nothing else happening on any of the other crime categories. Again, similar results for the border districts as well. So you want to do some validity checks. One could be the fact that there could be a simple substitution away from hard liquor towards other types of liquor. Now, in that case, we shouldn't see any effect, but we still find some effect on cases of sexual assault. Second, it could be that probably this reduction started even before the policy change came into effect. Now, Kerala, it wasn't an exogenous change in some sense, right? So the state government made a conscious decision, though the political economy of it doesn't seem like they wanted to do anything with women's safety at all. It was all a political economy decision because they were faced with these corruption charges by the opposition. But still, we want to check that, if suppose this policy was actually came in 2013, which it actually did not. So it's just a placebo test to see if, if we take the regulation to come in 2013, do we still see any negative effects or not? Well, so as we saw in the graph as well, if anything, there's a slightly positive effect on cases of sexual assault. Nothing's happening on any of the other crime rates, except for dowry death, which it was slightly falling, but we don't see anything on the main specification anyways for dowry deaths. For border districts, again, some positives on assault, nothing significant. On rapes, now the positives actually become significant. So as I said, that the previous positive effect that we saw post the implementation may just be because of reporting. And that's what we find even in the pre-trends. The reporting pre-trends for rape was anyways positive. Now, we want to check for some of the heterogeneities which should make sense. So the first heterogeneity we want to test for is the initial level of IMFL consumption. Now, in districts where the initial level of hard liquor consumption is large, we should expect that this policy change should have a greater effect on crime rates in those districts. And that's what we exactly find. We find that when it comes to cases of sexual assault and eve teasing, these are the districts where you see maximum effect in fall in these crimes reported. Heterogeneity by year, as expected, we see greater effects in 2015 as compared to 2014. And this would be the case, because 2014, only half the year was really, there was treatment. In 2015, the entire year, the districts were exposed to the treatment. However, the pre-trends don't match exactly. So we are concerned here. And a way out is to use a synthetic control method where we use a data-driven methodology to construct a control group such that that control group matches our treatment group in terms of pre-trends on each of the crime categories. And that's what we do here. We give a different weight to each of the districts in our control areas. And here we define our control pool in two ways. First control pool is all the districts lying in the neighboring states. And the second control pool is all the states lying in the southern part of India. Because we don't want to make, we just want data to tell us which should be a good control group, which matches well on pre-trends. And when we do that, this is what we find. So the synthetic control method estimates show that, so when the donor pool is the neighboring states, there is still a significant and negative effect on cases of assaults, especially sexual assaults reported by women. And these are in terms of percentages. So if you want to compare them to the previous estimates, you'll have to compare the 25% number that I showed you in the previous estimate to the numbers here. Where we use the donor pool as all the southern states, we find that the number actually increases. It increases to about 50% in terms of the magnitude of the effect. To look at the fact whether we were able to manage to match our control and treatment areas well in terms of pre-trends, there's a test that one can do for it, and we test for the same pre-trends across all the previous years. And we find that in the case of sexual assaults, we're able, so we cannot reject the null that they have same pre-trends. Looking at rape, however, the trends on the test on pre-trends doesn't match for rape. So rape is something we just are not able to get a handle on in terms of pre-trends, and anything positive that you see here will then, it should just not be looked at as any causal effect. On domestic violence, we're again able to match in terms of pre-trends completely. And here what we find is that there's a negative effect of about 16% and 34% in the second specification on domestic violence. So if anything, there's also a negative effect on domestic violence. There's no positive effect on domestic violence as what we were worried about if there was a spillover of this massive drinking happening at home now and more inebriation at home. Well, maybe people are still drunk, but they were also drunk earlier. They were probably drinking outside and then coming back home. But there's some anecdotal evidence which I found, because when I was talking to a few people there, the women were actually complaining. The women said that, earlier they would drink outside, and come home and sleep. Now they drink, inside, and they ask us to make snacks for them. And really, that really irritates us. So if anything, that is something which has really made our lives worse because we have to cook more for them. And earlier they would just eat and drink outside and make merry and then come back home and sleep. So that's just anecdotal evidence for you. So what's happening? Well, our hypothesis is that because of this regulation, there was a decreased interpersonal interaction between women and these inebriated men, because mostly in these bars, men are the ones who are drinking. Women don't drink in these bars, like hardly any women drink in these local bars. So it's basically when men are coming back from these bars, coming back home, is when they're most likely to get in touch with these women on the road or in public transport systems and behave badly with them. However, the other competing hypothesis is that, what if, policing is becoming better, the quality of policing. We have a control for quantity of policing, but we don't know about quality of policing, right? So what we do to see whether what's really happening is that, so we look at the effects on other crime variables as well. So we look at the effects on something which is reported as hurt. So what is hurt in the NCRB definition? It basically refers to these fights that are reported amongst men especially, where there are fights that break out on the road or in public areas, and these are reported as being under a particular IPC which falls under hurt. So you've hurt someone else physically. And so these are a large number of crimes. Then you have theft, which is theft basically happening outside the home. So you have on the road, in the public transport system. Burglary are the thefts that happen inside the home. So when something is stolen from the house, you have kidnapping, and then you have murder, which are self-explanatory. And here we find the negative effects are there still, but they're on these, more so on this crime called hurt, which is again very similar to sexual assault. So if you're drunk, maybe you're more likely in a public space to break out in a fight with another group of men. And these incidences are also going down. Theft, there is some negative effect, significant only in one specification. The others which are or should be affected by policing, like burglary, kidnapping, and murder, here we don't find any effects of this policy change. So there is some evidence of the mechanism being that it's the inebriated men in the public spaces coming in contact either with women or with other men that's leading to these changes in crime rates. So I guess we've shown in the paper that there is a negative effect of approximately 25% on an average on cases of sexual assaults reported by women. And other crimes like physical assaults on other men are also falling down because of this regulation change. So thank you. I hope I'm in time. Okay, great.
Thank you. So do we have any questions? Fancy?
Yeah, it's not very clear. Yeah. But I could see if there is information on violations. Yeah, one could find that out. I could. I agree with, yeah, so that could be another thing that social drinking is very different from drinking alone, or maybe in just a group of one or two, like, just with your, yeah, because social drinking, there's a different bonhomie to it. There's a different camaraderie where if you're indulging in something bad, your peers are going to egg you on. Okay, do it. And that's what we find in India a lot of times, that most of these sexual assaults reported by women are by these group of men who are misbehaving with them. And you also feel sort of powerful when you're in a group, which is together drunk. You somehow feel more powerful as than if you were single and drunk.
I don't know if there is any data to compare like that. Final comment is more about
sexual assaults. As I said, districts are quite huge. So I doubt that migration or going over the weekends to Kerala would be an issue because you can still buy and drink at home. It's not like hard liquor is completely stopped. You can still, but yeah, the costs are going to be more. You'll have to go to a liquor vend and buy and come back home and drink. But these districts are very huge. So it may be happening like right on the border villages. That's quite possible. But if you look at the district as a whole, that proportion should be very small. So we could also exclude the border districts to address that concern. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, one more.
I think it will be helpful if you may be able to say something about the degree of the domestic violence. I mean, there's an assault, there's a rape, there's something else. I mean, how each time is different. Something are very light and something are very heavy. And maybe that you can also explain why you don't, there's something really different with rape, probably very like a big, like heavy types of.
It's a very extreme crime. It's a very, very extreme crime, right? So, but how do I do that? Maybe I should talk to you.
One more question.
Thanks, that was really great story you're telling. It's really makes sense. Everything you said made sense to me.
Okay, that's nice. Thank you.
My only comment would be, I might, like if I were writing this, I might actually switch the robustness and make it the main result, only because you only have really one treated. You just have one treated in the state.
Yeah. So, but there are many districts within the state. They're about
I know,
yeah.
it's still really a state policy. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people say you should cluster standard errors at the state level, which means the standard errors are actually biased because we only have one of them. This is exactly what synthetic control is made for. So like, I personally think that you should switch them.
Okay.
Synthetic control
As your main result, as your second. I can always do that. By the way, we also cluster the standards at the state level, and then we bootstrap them as well. So I didn't show those results, but we also have them. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you. Any other
Maybe we're done.
questions? No? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the liberty to introduce Samantha to all of you.
Hi, so thanks everyone. Is my mic on? Yeah. So I'm Sam Rawlings from the University of Reading, and this is joint work with Zara Siddiqui at the University of Bristol on domestic violence and child mortality. So given the title of the session, I'm not going to spend too much time kind of laying out the context. I'm sure most of the audience is kind of aware. But just briefly, here when I talk about domestic violence, I'm specifically talking about physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner. And in 2010, a quite large study estimated that the global lifetime prevalence of this type of intimate partner violence was around 30%. So around 1 in 3 women around the globe at some point in their life will experience this type of violence within an intimate relationship. And it's prevalent across all societies, but there is variation. So prevalence rates tend to be higher in developing regions, such as Central Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's up to 2/3 of women, and South Asia, where it was estimated almost 1 in 2 women. So it's a significant problem. And we know that domestic violence has direct costs that are borne by the victims, and I don't just mean monetary costs, although there's evidence that women who experience this type of violence have reduced earnings. They also have worse health, and they're, of course, at risk of significant risk of death. But what we're interested in this paper is that through its effects on maternal physical and or mental health, domestic violence may affect, for example, risk behaviors, so smoking, drinking. It may affect feeding practices of children, so initiating breastfeeding, duration of breastfeeding, or other aspects of infant and toddler care, all of which might affect a child's nutrition and development. And this is also in addition to direct effects of violence. For example, if a woman suffers violence while she's pregnant. So the existing literature on the relationship between domestic violence and health is mostly in the field of public health and medicine, and it's documented a negative correlation between domestic violence and child health. It tends to be based in developed nations and on small, non-random samples, although there's a couple of exceptions to this. Within economics, the focus has really been on the US context and specifically violent assaults during pregnancy. So there's a couple of really nice papers that look at this. The kind of first seminal paper on this was a paper by Anna Iser in 2011. And she uses data on female hospitalizations and birth outcomes for the whole state of California to try to account for selection into assaults, into domestic violence. She uses a control function approach where she exploits variation in implementation or effectiveness of domestic violence laws to try to account for the selection. And she finds that serious incidents of assault reduce birth weight. In a similar vein, a very recent paper by Curry and others uses linked administrative data from New York City on police reports on birth outcomes and finds a robust negative effect of assaults during pregnancy on birth outcomes. So here, both of these papers are looking at quite extreme forms of violence, violence that results either in a woman having to go to hospital or report to the police. And they're looking at essentially birth weight, or the Curry paper also looks at some other outcomes. So they're looking at quite extreme forms of violence and birth weight, essentially. So our work is related to this strand of literature, but it's answering a slightly different question. What we're interested in is whether children of female victims of domestic violence are less likely to survive through the first 5 years of their life. And to do this, we use data from the domestic violence modules contained within the demographic and health surveys, as we've already seen represented today. I'll talk a little bit about the surveys. And we compile data on these measures of domestic violence and child mortality from 32 developing countries. And this enables us to use a sample at its largest of around 1.3 million children born over a 50-year period. So the key contribution of this work is that it's the first large-scale, multi-country study of its kind to examine the link between domestic violence and mortality. And we are interested in what the data tells us about the relationship, but we also try to use a number of identification strategies to try to examine the causal relationship between domestic violence and mortality. So the data that we use is the DHS data, which consists of nationally representative surveys. We have 55 DHS surveys carried out in 32 developing countries. So the map here just shows the distribution of these countries from over the world, and the darker countries are those that are included in our sample. So in the DHS data, women aged 18 to 49 are interviewed, and complete fertility histories are collected. So what this means is that a woman is asked about every birth she ever had and the outcome of that birth. So when was your child born? Is your child still alive? If they died, when did they die? Okay, so we're able to use this information to construct measures of mortality for each of a woman's child over her lifetime. And we look at death in the first 30 days, so neonatal mortality. We look at death in the first 12 months, infant mortality, and death in the first 60 months, so under 5 mortality. So that's going to be our outcome of interest. And then we also look separately at physical and sexual violence. So we do combine the two, but we want to look at whether there are different effects of these different types of violence. And the way in which violence is measured is through the conflict tactics scale. So women are asked about specific acts of violence. So, for example, a woman would be asked, has your husband ever pushed you? Has your husband ever slapped you? Has your husband ever forced you to have sex when you didn't want it? And we use a binary variable, which is 1, if a woman answered yes to any of these questions on specific acts of abuse. We consider both lifetime experience of abuse, so the woman is first asked, has your husband ever pushed you? And if she answers yes, she's then asked, did this occur in the last 12 months? So we have a lifetime experience, but also recent violence, and I'll explain in a moment how we differentially use these measures. So just briefly, descriptively, we observe in our sample that average mortality is higher amongst, the average mortality of children, I should say, is higher amongst victims as compared to non-victims of domestic violence. So this is just for neonatal mortality, but the pattern is very similar for other measures. And this column is any violence, this is physical violence, this is sexual violence. And what we essentially see is that neonatal mortality amongst non-victims of physical violence is about 2.9%, and amongst victims it's 3.6%. So just descriptively, we can see that the mortality of children tends to be higher amongst of victims. But we also observe that victims differ on a number of other observable dimensions. So, for example, they're younger when they have their first child, they're less educated, they have less educated partners. And so in our analysis, we control for a range of potential confounders, and we also, as a check, perform matching estimates to try to account for selection into violence on observables. And we'll also do an IV strategy, which I'll explain later. So what I'll do first is take you through the baseline model and our baseline results before I then talk about the extensions and, for example, the instrumental variable strategy that we use. So our baseline empirical specification is just, we estimate linear probability models where our dependent variable, this variable here, is just the binary variable indicating whether a child died in the first 30 days, 12 months, or 5 years of their life. And our measure of violence of interest is also this binary variable for either physical or sexual or either or. So this baseline specification, what we're doing is we're looking at a woman's lifetime experience of violence and how that relates to the mortality risk of all of her children. We control for a comprehensive set of control variables, so things that we observe differ between victims and non-victims. We control for country fixed effects, year of birth fixed effects, and country times year fixed effects to ensure that we identify the effect from within country year variation, and our error terms are clustered at the country level. So, as I said, that specification is really looking at lifetime experience of abuse and the entire history of a woman's fertility and mortality outcomes of her children. So for this, we get this very large sample where we can kind of systematically look at what the relationship looks like over time and space. But for example, the lifetime experience of abuse doesn't tell us directly whether that abuse was experienced at the same time as the child was 1 year old or was born or whatever. So to try to pin down more concretely the timing of abuse, we consider violence experienced in the last 12 months and only births that occurred in the last 12 months. So now we're looking at a woman's experience of violence and directly the outcomes of her children born in the last 12 months. This now means we can only consider neonatal mortality because anyone born in the last 12 months hasn't been fully exposed to risk of infant or under 5 mortality. Okay, so the results from this analysis, when we look at ever experienced violence, we find quite consistently a positive and significant association between a woman's experience of violence and the mortality risk of her children. For example, with physical violence, if I take the example of neonatal mortality, exposure, lifetime exposure to physical violence is associated with a 0.4 percentage point increase in risk of neonatal mortality, which doesn't sound like much, but if you recall from the earlier graph, the average amongst victims is about 3.6%. So it's somewhere around 10% of the mean. The effects for sexual violence are smaller, they're about half the size, and when we look at any violence, it kind of matches very closely physical violence. So a kind of theme that we'll see from the results is that what we tend to find is it's physical violence that matters. And so when we look at recent violence, so again, this is just looking at violence that occurred in the last 12 months, births that occurred in the last 12 months, we see that we don't find any effects of sexual violence anymore, but we continue to find a very similar sized effect of physical violence. So again, children who are born to victims who experience violence in the last 12 months are 0.4 percentage points more likely to die within the first month of being born compared to children born to non-victims. And you can see our sample size obviously is much smaller here. So it's around 50,000 births that occurred in the 12 months preceding the survey. So at first pass, we find a positive association between both lifetime experience of violence and recent violence, and in particular physical violence on the risk of mortality of children. To check kind of whether selection on observables, we calculate matching estimates for our relationships of interest using propensity score matching. We match on child characteristics, parents' characteristics, urban status, household wealth, country fixed effects, year of birth fixed effects. And essentially, we find very similar sized effects. And again, what we find is that when we consider recent violence, it's really physical violence that matters. So it seems to be that it's more about a woman's physical, perhaps more direct effects of violence on mortality. So the last thing we do to try to extend our analysis is we try to investigate the causal effect, or to check whether there's still an effect when we try to account for selection into violence. And we use an IV strategy for this. So similar to the ISA paper that uses variation in effectiveness of violence laws, our identification here comes from a measure of the strength of domestic violence laws and rape laws within a country over time. And we use rape laws alongside domestic violence laws because actually where domestic violence laws do exist, frequently they don't legislate against sexual violence or marital rape. The measure that we're going to use comes from the OECD Development Centre's Social Institutions and Gender Index. And it has a measure there for the effectiveness of rape laws and whether marital rape is included in the definition of rape. And we see variation in this over countries and across time. So the CIGI indices for these laws varies on a 5-point scale from 0 to 1. And the indices are capturing discrimination against women, so lower values are better and higher values are worse, counterintuitively in some ways. So here, a value of 0 is given to a country where there's legislation in place and there are no reported problems with implementation of these laws. And a value of 1 would be given to a country if there's no legislation in place. So for a number of our countries, there's no laws against domestic violence. There's very few or none, in fact, where there's no laws on rape. And then the intermediate values vary according to failures of the law. So for example, if laws aren't enforced, if there isn't the institutional capacity to help women to leave their partners, and for the rape measure, if marital rape isn't included, then it wouldn't be given a value of 0. And we see variation within 14 countries over time, so about half of the countries in our sample either introduced laws where there was no law previously on domestic violence, or strengthened the existing penal code to give harsher sentences or to help police better enforce these laws. And we use an average of these indices in the analysis because we have a bit more variation in domestic violence laws as opposed to rape laws. And we don't really want to be identifying a very small number of countries for rape laws, but we do want to include that information in our analysis. So our identifying assumption here to satisfy the exclusion restriction is that there are no direct effects or other pathways from legal sanctions against violence except through its instance of domestic violence. A couple of concerns might be, for example, if just general economic development affects the incidence of laws, so country becomes richer, more developed, it decides to implement these laws, and also that affects mortality. So we control for GDP at the country year level. And, or if laws protecting women are part of a package of laws, or there's just general changes to social norms or whatever, that mean that there are other laws being passed that are protecting women in different ways, but might also directly affect mortality. So we then also control for an index of what's called discriminatory laws against women, which is also from this CIGI database and also varies over time. So when we run our IV analysis, we find a similar story. We don't find a statistically significant effect of sexual violence. We do find a statistically significant effect of any violence or physical violence. It's large, it's positive, it suggests that the association that we find when we run our linear probability model is not driven entirely by unobserved confounders. The first stage coefficient is what we might expect. So remember, the higher values of this indicate that women are kind of less protected by the legal system. So higher values or less protection in the legal framework leads to an increase in violence. And in the F stat for the first stage, it's above 10 for any violence, and sexual violence is a little below 10 for physical violence. So we might want to focus just on this first column, maybe. So just quickly, how long have I got left? 5 minutes, that's fine. Robustness checks. So we just do a number of checks to see how robust our results are for additional controls that aren't available in all surveys. So woman's height, for example, is only in about 2/3 of our surveys, but you might think, so height is a measure of women's health, long-term health. We might think that this is related to their experience of abuse and also related to the mortality of their children. Actually, we find the results are almost identical. And religion, which for some reason, again, in about a third of our surveys isn't collected. When we control for religion, we don't find any effects on our estimates. And then finally, we run some placebo estimates in which we assign treatment of violence in the last 12 months to women who didn't experience violence in the last 12 months, but they had historically experienced violence. So we kind of throw out of our sample women who actually experienced violence recently, and then we treat, kind of incorrectly treat women who historically experienced violence as having experienced it in the last 12 months, and look at whether their historical experience of violence predicts mortality of their kids born in the last 12 months. And effectively, we don't find anything when we do this. Okay, so you can see for physical violence that the effects are very small. They're not statistically significant. Our matching, again, are two-stage least squares. The coefficients are massive. They're the wrong sign. The F stat is also very small, so changes in laws or strength of domestic violence laws don't appear to predict historical experience of violence. It's really the recent violence that where we find these laws matter. So to conclude, the paper provides evidence of a strong positive association between domestic violence experienced by mothers on the subsequent mortality of their children in a very large sample of developing countries. Our results are similar when we use matching methods, and our IV results support the existence of a causal relationship. So our work provides a kind of first systematic analysis that quantifies the relationship between domestic violence and child mortality in a cross-country context, and we feel have implications for the cost of domestic violence beyond those borne directly by the mother in trying to understand the child health production process in developing countries where large fractions of women suffer domestic violence. We also feel that a kind of quite interesting or neat result from our IV estimation is that perhaps a deterrent or incapacitation effect of legal sanctions on the instance of domestic violence. So we do tend to find that when the legal framework better protects women, that this leads to a reduction in violence. So thank you. And comments and questions after. No, unfortunately not, no. So in what way would you think that the OLS would overestimate? Because Yeah, so the bias of the OLS is difficult to quantify, actually, because there might also be measurement error, right, in reporting of violence, and that also might be tied up in our analysis. And I guess we have to think a bit more about what might be potential confounders and how they might drive what they might do to the coefficient. But I think we can't really say that much about what we'd expect the difference between the OLS and IV to be. It's quite a complicated story. Yes.
Like two questions. One is about heterogeneous effects. So have you looked at differential effects for boys and girls? So this might like
No, so we haven't. Actually, I was thinking about this just the last. Yes, yes. Yeah.
So if you don't find anything, of course, it's not worth proving, because at least it's like some sort of...
Yeah. So I wonder if the placebo that we did in some way captures that, because...
That's what the matching estimate.
No, so let me... So in this placebo specification, what we're doing is we're taking women who didn't experience violence in the last 12 months, but did historically experience it. And okay. Yes. Okay, so if we then had where we showed the direct effect of the laws on, okay, yes, thank you, that's a good point. Any other questions? Oh.
So you have country fixed effects, but can you try more granular? So DHS also has more granular identifiers within a country, right?
So region, yeah. It varies depending on the country. Yeah, we could do. We haven't tried that. Yes, yeah, we do. Yeah.
India's a huge country.
Yeah. So we'd want state fixed effects.
State fixed
yeah.
effects.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good point. We should probably check for. That means I'll have to recode everything. 32 countries. So I think we don't currently. I we probably do. I probably do have region in there because I've used this data for other stuff where I've controlled for region. But that's a good point. Yeah. Yes.
You have several instruments that you combine together.
So two, yeah. So in fact, we're kind of a bit unsure about whether to use this rape index, because actually most countries in our time period don't make any changes to legislation. And what we're really identifying the effect on is changes in legislation within country. I didn't show here because of time constraints, but when we just used the one instrument, the domestic violence index, the effect sizes are very similar and the results are actually the same. Did you have a concern about using two?
Instead of using the categorical variable, you could create a dummy for each entity.
Yeah.
And then if you are aware that you have too many instruments, you can just double lasso a machine learning algorithm to select the instrument.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming on the last day of the conference, and hope you enjoyed. Yes, and the useful comments. Thank you.